Lecture 16, July 1, 14959 Society Block. Last time I attempted to show you that our reflections on the relations between constituents and constitutum and the connections we established between them and the Kantian we, which we saw as a subject with a social dimension, did not amount to a sociologism. By way of demonstration I offered a brief critique of a view opposed to that of Kant, namely, that of Durkheim, who incidentally was well versed in Kant's philosophy and had made the attempt to provide a social explanation for the Kantian forms of intuition and some other important logical and epistemological categories. When we perceived that such explanations necessarily presupposed the forms or categories they set out to explain, and conversely that these forms or categories refer to existing things, realities. My aim was not only to demonstrate to you the impossibility of an epistemological sociologism, but also to show you that the question of which comes first, actual existence or formal category, is misguided. That is to say, these different elements simply cannot be separated from one another. And that this is the case points ultimately to the fact that their apparent existence as separate entities is itself the product of the reflecting mind rather than something that can be ascribed to being or existing things as such. On the other hand, you must not forget that this Kantian we contains a reference to the social, that is, not just the individual, nature of the transcendental subject. His inability to dispense with such an expression as we does not simply reflect an old-fashioned linguistic usage, a kind of politeness, in which an I is replaced by a we, whereby it remains unclear whether it does not also express something of the royal we. It contains in addition a very important epistemological insight. You can picture this to yourselves by saying that if epistemology expects from each of us sitting in this room, as it traditionally does, that each person can regard himself as the fount of all knowledge, then this claim is made arbitrary in the extreme by the fact that each person, who of course looks after his own interests, can be replaced by every other subject. Furthermore, the point of departure is not final, if only because an expression I that can be replaced by every other I must be occasionalist in nature. It proves that the I that is being appealed to is not being taken seriously as an one. On the other hand, this kind of epistemology, by which I mean this entire strand of subjectivist philosophy, cannot avoid the issue since experience can be generated only through the reference to a personal subject. If immediacy is elevated into the ultimate criterion of knowledge, then of course every consciousness is immediate only to itself. That is to say, the facts of consciousness are given immediately only to each individual concerned. The facts of consciousness of others are only ever given indirectly, through communication, by making inferences from analogous situations, through empathy, or however we wish to describe it. You can see here a very remarkable antinomy in this general explanatory framework of epistemology as a whole, which must be deemed to include Kant's critique of pure reason. This is that, on the one hand, the talk of an I necessarily implies a we, so that as an I it cannot be taken seriously. On the other hand, if no appeal is made to this one, the idea of an immediate point of departure, the experience which stands at the beginning of all knowledge cannot be maintained. Traditional epistemology has never succeeded in overcoming this contradiction. This is one more reason, I would say, for abandoning the entire approach. As the foundation of epistemology, the we is not immediately given, but highly mediated. In exchange it is saved from arbitrariness. In contrast, the I is immediate in every instance, but as a starting point it is always arbitrary in comparison to the we. Thus, taken in isolation, as inflexible models, both these points of departure are relatively arbitrary and problematic. I do not wish to say more about them at present. Those of you who would like to pursue the question further should look up what I have to say about it in Chapter 4 of Against Epistemology. At any rate, you cannot escape the fact that social factors lie concealed in the crucial attributes that Kant assigns to the subject. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit may in a manner of speaking be regarded as the attempt to explicate the latent social motifs that are objectively present in the so-called problem of constitution. If you reflect for one moment that the basic defining feature, the attribute that underpins everything else in Kant's concept of subjectivity, is the dichotomy between spontaneity and receptivity, or activity and passivity, then this points unequivocally to the social process in which two elements are always present. I am referring to work and nature on which work operates. There has long been an idea that knowledge really just repeats what has always existed in the actual process of human labor. That we are dealing with a kind of raw material, on the one hand, that is then given shape by consciousness, on the other. Something of this idea reverberates through the whole of the critique of pure reason. We can doubtless say, and this has been explored a number of times in detail, for example, by the late Franz Borkenau in his book on 17th-century theories in the Age of Manufacture 3, we can doubtless say that in their objective form theories of cognition are a kind of reflex of the labor process. Not in the sense that they have been brought forth causally by the labor process, but in the sense that, when consciousness reflects upon itself, it necessarily arrives at a concept of rationality that corresponds to the rationality of the labor process. I have in mind here the qualities of the division of labor and the planned processing of materials given in nature. On the other hand, it would be quite misguided to say, and I must confess to you that I have on occasion been very tempted by this idea that the transcendental subject actually is society. It undoubtedly has one feature in common with society. This is that only the global social subject, not the contingent individual subject, possesses the character of universality, of all-encompassing totality, that Kant ascribes to his transcendental subject. We may add that behind the idea of constitution stands that of labor as social labor, and not just isolated, individual labor. On the other hand, however, in contrast with that global social subject which may be regarded as the summation of all the concrete factors of society, the Kantian transcendental subject, that is, the famous I think that accompanies all my representations, is a complete abstraction that has nothing in common with it. Needless to say, this social interpretation of the transcendental subject should not be thought of as arbitrary. We can say that in its relation to society thought qua the Kantian I think is both things. On the one hand, it is the truth of society, its universality. It points beyond the merely contingent nature of individual existence and, ultimately, even beyond the conditional and ephemeral form that a society possesses at certain stages of its history. It is truly the /hoyo of society, the overall social rationality in which the utopia of a rationally organized society is already implicit. On the other hand, this transcendental subject also contains, if I may risk a rather bold statement, the untruth of society. That means, The abstraction characteristic of this transcendental subject is nothing but the internalized and hypostatized form of man's domination of nature. This always comes into being through the elimination of qualities, through the reduction of qualitative distinctions to quantitative forms. It is therefore objectively always abstract in character. We may say, then, that the deepest reason for our refusal to identify the concept of truth with society is not to be found in the fact that there is a pure kingdom of truth entirely separate from society, a ZOP, O, V1, TLXO. Of the kind that Plato was still able to imagine, for it is rather the case that the concept of truth of which social factors form constituent parts points beyond the shape of society as it happens to exist. Furthermore, in the form ratified by epistemology it bears the stigmata of the historical process in the shape in which it has come down to us. That is all I have to say for the present about the relation of Kantian philosophy to society. I may perhaps add only that the ideas I have presented to you here with their rather complex implications are not so alien to Kantian philosophy as they may appear to be to the actual text of the Critique of Pure Reason. In the Critique of Practical Reason the elimination of empirical elements is taken much further than in the Critique of Pure Reason. In the later text the fear of contact with the empirical, with actual reality, is taken to such lengths that the object of practical reason, namely, action, is declared to be simply independent of empirical reality and to be something that has arisen purely from the subjective imagination, in contrast to the objects of theoretical reason. Thus the Critique of Practical Reason goes well beyond the formalism of even the Critique of Pure Reason, but ends up after a very complicated trajectory with ideas of a just society, a conception of mankind that is actually inconceivable on the basis of the Kantian program if we were to preserve that pure distance from the facts. It would be an interesting project, one that really ought to be tackled seriously at some point, to show how the apparently extreme formalism of Kantian philosophy actually contains elements of transmutation into a kind of materialism. I should like now to say a few words about the Kantian block which I have mentioned several times in a more or less desultory way. 5. I would like to discuss it in connection with the ideas that we have been considering and with which we are still concerned, and in particular with the kinds of experience that are articulated by Kant's philosophy. I believe I observed at one point that this Kantian block can be understood as a form of unmediated Cartesian dualism that is reflexive, that reflects upon itself. It is a dualism in which a great chasm yawns between inner and outer, a chasm that can never be bridged. 6. This chasm is the chasm of the alienation of human beings from one another, and the alienation of human beings from the world of things. This alienation is in fact socially caused. It is created by the universal exchange relation. Through the idea that our knowledge is blocked, Kantian philosophy expresses as an experience the state of philosophy at the time. In particular, it expresses the idea that in this universally mediated society, determined as it is by exchange, in this society marked by radical alienation, we are denied access to existing reality as if by a blank wall. This is an experience, incidentally, that was suggested to Kant by his reading of Rousseau, which as we know today played a major role in the formation of the entire Kantian system. I believe that it is important in this context for you to realize that this idea of a block, of unbridgeable chasms between different realms, is in fact ubiquitous in the Critique of Pure Reason. It does not refer simply to the single point where it first makes its appearance, namely the question of the unknowability of the so-called things in themselves. For when Kant says that the ideas are not valid objects of knowledge, but merely regulative ideas, this is effectively to assert the XWPTA. J6. The disjunction between truth in the ontological sense and our ability to comprehend. In the light of this emphatic assertion of a qualitative leap between the ontological world of ideas and the possibility of our obtaining valid knowledge, the salvaging efforts I told you about earlier, 7 all have something of the flavor of an insurance policy. In fact, the position with Kant, and this too is something rightly criticized by his successors, is that the two spheres of the understanding, that is, the really valid knowledge relating to experience, and reason, that is, the knowledge of ideas, point in opposite directions and are incapable of being reconciled. This remains true even though the organ of knowledge, namely the aoyo of man himself, in other words thought, is identical in both cases. This is an unmediated piece of thinking that is at bottom difficult to reconcile with Kant's ambition, and he did have such an ambition, to create a self-consistent system. Thus we really are talking here about what Nietzsche meant when he said that I am banished from all truth. 8. What he had in mind was the disenchanted world which has been emptied of meaning, a topic I have tried to explain to you at some length. 9. This motif of radical enlightenment has become fused with the theological idea that always accompanies it, to wit, that is finite. Conditioned beings, we can only have finite and conditional, not unconditional, knowledge. But I should like to add to what I have already said and mention something that has not been said up to now and goes beyond it in important respects. I believe that it is worthwhile reflecting here a little more deeply on Kant's relation to the natural sciences. If I am not mistaken, Kant is the last of the major philosophers who thought of himself as being in agreement with the natural sciences, while at the same time holding fast to the traditional themes of philosophy, that is, of metaphysics. After him, and here Hegel's case is exemplary, the two branches of knowledge diverged completely. That is to say, philosophers who understood something of science generally came to conclusions that were bluntly hostile to philosophy, and they basically regarded logic and the methodology of science as the only possible and valid form of philosophy. Conversely, those philosophers who were unwilling to abandon their metaphysical impulses strove to maintain them as a pure realm on their own, isolated from the mathematical sciences, as far as was possible. The first symptom of this development was in fact the Hegelian system. This system did try to synthesize these strands of thought in an external manner, but it manifestly failed in the attempt as far as science was concerned, that is to say, in part 2, the philosophy of nature, of the encyclopedia. I mean by this that what he says there is in flagrant contradiction to the facts of science. Kant is initially rather more successful here. But if I understand this doctrine of a Kantian block more or less correctly, in particular in its implications for the unknowability of the thing in itself, then you begin to see, perhaps for the very first time, how Kant can be said to represent a historical watershed leading to subsequent developments. In philosophy, much as could be said of the bourgeoisie of his age, you begin to see, in a kind of premonition that is not clearly articulated, the idea that science does not necessarily represent the last word about nature. Kant was enough of a scientist and was sufficiently self-confident to refrain from calling for a kind of knowledge that would reveal the true essence of nature. In this respect he differed from the great Romantic philosophers. I am thinking here of Ritter and Schelling, and even, in a sense, of Schopenhauer. Kant, however, did not do this. He would certainly have rejected all such aspirations as obscurantist. But he knows, or rather, I should not really say he knows. I should say instead that it is a metaphysical experience implicit in the doctrine of the block in the critique of pure reason that the object of nature that we define with our categories is not actually nature itself. For our knowledge of nature is really so preformed by the demand that we dominate nature, something exemplified by the chief method of finding out about nature, namely the scientific experiment, that we end up understanding only those aspects of nature that we can control. In addition, there is also the underlying feeling that while we are putting out our nets and catching more and more things in them, there is a sense in which nature itself seems to keep receding from us. And the more we take possession of nature, the more its real essence becomes alien to us. I said to you at one point in an earlier lecture 10 that the categories of subjectivism and reification are not incompatible opposites, but corollaries. That is to say, the more subjectivism there is, the more reification, and vice versa. This means that the more we appropriate, the more we find ourselves alienated from what we are really looking for, and what we do actually appropriate is only a kind of lifeless residue. This feeling, if I may for once make use of a highly dubious psychological expression, this experience, is hard to express in rational terms, because the sphere of rationality is the sphere that contradicts experience. Nevertheless, this feeling is deeply embedded in Kant's philosophy. Thus we may say that what Kant shares with positivism is the insistence on the finite nature of knowledge and the rejection of metaphysics as a wild extravagance. But we must add that the atmosphere which informs his entire way of thinking is extremely unlike that of positivism, if indeed we can speak at all of atmosphere in connection with positivism. That is to say, we have a situation in which knowledge is illusory because the closer it comes to Er's object, the more it shapes it in its own image and thus drives it further and further away, much as civilization has driven the wildest and most exotic animals into the most inaccessible jungles. This is what is reflected in the doctrine of the block. It is a kind of metaphysical mourning, a kind of memory of what is best, of something that we must not forget, but that we are nevertheless compelled to forget. This memory is quite alien to positivism, just as positivism has no room for any theory that propounds the idea of a block on knowledge. Instead, positivism would say that this is all nonsense, these are all obsolete fantasies. Stick to the positive facts, to the given realities, nothing further lies behind them. However, Kant's historical consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, stretches to the point of refusing to be fobbed off with this. The memory of the questions philosophy formerly asked is still so powerful in him that even against the grain of his own positivistic rationality, he retains at least a notion of what lies beyond reason. You can see, then, that his relation to science is contradictory. Science is still the model, as in older philosophy, but now that it is under the aegis of the block, of the fact that knowledge gives us only phenomena and not noumena, it is already as problematic as it was to become in post-Kantian thought. You can see from this, and if you wish you can turn this into a criticism of Kant, that he is inconsistent here, that he does not follow his arguments through to their logical conclusions. On the one hand, he cannot bring himself to venture at least some statements about this authentic world that is slipping from our grasp and about its nature, but leaves it so empty of content that to all intents and purposes it really does amount to nothing at all. On the other hand, he lacks the logical consistency of the positivists who hold fast to what is given, its interconnections and its forms, while dismissing everything over and above that as mere phantoms. Faced by these alternatives, Kant can be described as a vacillating thinker, unable to make up his mind. But I should like to remind you here that his reluctance to follow his ideas to their logical conclusion is the expression of what might be called the metaphysics of the block. To follow through his ideas to their logical conclusion would mean ignoring this block and the experience underlying it. It would mean creating an unambiguous identity governed by the dominance of the understanding, whereas the decisive feature of Kant is that the AVUFLV1 July 5, the power of memory, thrives because that identity is not possible. Kant prefers to accept that illogicality. He would rather acquiesce in the inconsistencies to which we have repeatedly drawn attention than create a seamless intellectual harmony which nevertheless would prevent him from delivering on his specific philosophical ambitions. To take matters to their logical conclusion means denying the existence of the block and laying claim to absolute identity. The dialectical or antinomic structure of Kantian philosophy means that it aspires to create a system, to provide a central point, which is that of the idea that can construct reality, but at the same time, it refuses to regard the world as identical with that idea. This implies a vast effort to square our circle, and it is very easy to criticize him for the errors that spring from it. I believe that this is the deepest thing to be found in Kant. On the one hand, he holds fast to the intention of philosophy to understand reality as a whole, to decode the totality. At the same time, he declares that philosophy is incapable of this, and that the only form in which the totality can be grasped is the expression of the fact that it cannot be comprehended. I have formulated this in a very pointed, perhaps overstated way, and many of you will perhaps be shocked by it. Nevertheless, I believe that I have been completely faithful to the Kantian idea here, which I perceive to be deeply paradoxical. It is the attempt to give an account of the totality, while simultaneously conceding that this totality is no such thing, that subject and object do not seamlessly fit together, and that ultimately the absence of this seamless fit, which is what the block amounts to, is itself what a romantic artist once named the innermost life of the world. 11. I should like to emphasize that, with hindsight, this seems to me to provide the justification for the procedure I have adopted in this course of lectures. This procedure is one that places far greater emphasis on the ruptures, the immanent antinomies in his thinking, than upon its harmonious, synthetic form. This is because these ruptures can almost be said to constitute the Kantian philosophy, for the reason that they reveal the innermost core of his thinking. This core is encapsulated in the idea that the totality that the mind is just able to encompass is no more than the fact that as mind it is unable to comprehend the totality, but that it somehow contrives after all to comprehend what it does nor comprehend, and the fact that it cannot comprehend it. With this observation we have reached a critical point in our discussion of Kantian philosophy. Like all intellectual phenomena, a philosophy does not stand outside time. It exists within time, nor merely in the sense that it can be forgotten, or subject to different interpretations, but rather in the sense that its own meaning unfolds in time, forming a variety of configurations that release meanings and generate meanings that were not remotely considered at its inception. This is particularly true of the question of the block, about which J have attempted to say something today by way of conclusion. If I am nor mistaken, we are looking here at the deepest aspect of Kant, at his attempts to say what cannot be said, and his entire philosophy is actually nothing more than a form of stammering, infinitely expanded and elevated. Like the act of stammering, it is a form of Dada, the attempt to say what actually cannot be said. 12. And just as this motif of the block is the deepest aspect of Kant, it is highly paradoxical that it is this aspect that Kant has bequeathed to the stock of bourgeois wisdom, and has thus become the feature that will have made Kant look so old-fashioned to you. When I tell you about the Kantian XWPTA R, the Kantian block, I am reminded of a commonplace hit song or student song that I learned from my parents and that must have been current at about the turn of the century. It contained the lines, "The soul soars high into the air, the body rests upon the chair." This unspeakably pathetic piece of bourgeois wisdom represents in a sense the ultimate degradation, the ultimate fate of Kantian philosophy in the dire form to which it had sunk in the normal consciousness of the bourgeoisie. It is my view that this is a side of the Kantian philosophy that we have to think through so as to become fully aware that this degenerate form is not simply something that the wicked bourgeois have done to Kant, but rather something that is teleologically implicit in his philosophy from the outset. The structure of the block that I have attempted, perhaps over-emphatically, to convey to you is one that faces both ways. It faces not just towards metaphysical experience, but also towards the world. And the side it turns towards the world is all too similar to the world to which it turns. From this vantage point of the XWPWFLRK, or the dualism of Kantian philosophy, what is involved is a sort of arrangement between naturalism, the empirical world, on the one hand, and non-binding ideals on the other. Before going into this question, I should like to draw your attention to a very characteristic feature of Kant's philosophy. This is that the huge effort that he has made to ground experience has actually done that experience no harm. We might also say that it is a philosophy in which the distinction between appearance and essence does not occur to a significant degree. More precisely, it is to be found in the distinction between phenomenon and noumenon, but, characteristically, nothing is said about essences, only about appearances. In other words, the world of appearances, the ordinary world of things, the ordinary world of cause and effect, and of the empirical self, all of this survives unscathed in this philosophy just as it does in everyday consciousness. In this sense, Kantian philosophy is a philosophy of reconstruction. It merely reconstructs in scientific form what ordinary consciousness contains anyway. It may be said, therefore, to be far less radical and far less profound than, say, Hume's philosophy. Hume provided a penetrating critique of significant naturalistic concepts such as the self, causality and the thing. In so doing, he really did change the world to the point where it could be said that the self was lost beyond all redemption, as Mach expressed it. 13. In the same way, it could be said that for Hume there is no causality, there are no things. 14. Kant avoids such radical conclusions. Instead, in its entire vast profundity and effort, his philosophy amounts to recreating anew the world as it presents itself to consciousness, to producing with the enormous power of the productive imagination the world as it already exists. This feature of Kant contains as its implicit goal a possibility I had already mentioned. This is that in contrast to the rethinking of all deeper matters, in contrast to utopian thinking or to the realities of alienation, this grandiose metaphysical system was able to become the worldview of alienation and of the blunted consciousness of the bourgeoisie. Lecture 17, 16, Uli 1959 Ideology. The concept of depth. I tried last time to show you some of the features of Kant's philosophy that have contributed to its particular status as the standard philosophy of the so-called educated middle classes along the lines caricatured by Thomas Mann in the figure of Wulich, the headmaster in Buddenbrooks, who never failed to allude to the categorical imperative of our great fellow citizen from Königsberg when delivering himself of his thunderous speeches in honor of the Kaiser's birthday. It is nevertheless remarkable that such a vulnerable and eccentric philosophy as Kant's should have had this effect even though outward success was really the last thing on his mind. It is my opinion, however, that, as I have already pointed out, this philosophy must not be looked at abstractly on its own, but it must also be viewed as a social phenomenon, and that these are matters that must be given more weight than is usually the case. I have also said that perhaps the deepest reason for this lies in a quality of Kant's philosophy that we have only touched upon. This is that in the upshot, despite its much acclaimed critical and anti-dogmatic elements, the world, or what English philosophers, in particular Sir William Hamilton, dubbed the world of common sense, one managed to survive Kant's onslaught more or less unscathed. In other words, despite his transcendental idealism, the normal world of straightforward realism remains intact. I would add that this confirmation of the accustomed picture of the world, the accustomed concept of experience as characteristic of a world picture we can all live with, nevertheless contains an element that seemed more or less predestined for ideology because it implicitly negated the contrast between between appearance and essence. It tells us that even if the world we know is not the true and absolutely real world, it is one we can, and indeed must, come to terms with, because all we really know of the other world, the world of essence, is that it is different from what we know, and that is really all we can say about it. This gave a boost to the uncritical consciousness, the normal consciousness of the ordinary Philistine who simply wants to acquiesce in a more or less conventional view of the world without having to trouble himself further. You therefore find yourselves confronting the paradox that a philosophy like the Kantian that never ceases to insist on its claims to be critical ends up fostering uncritical thought. In this respect it stands at the opposite pole to Hegel, who had proclaimed that the existing world was rational, but who had made up for this with the concept of dialectics, the absolutely mediated nature of every existing thing. By doubting whether every existing thing is in reality what it immediately appears to Hegel ends up with a much more radical element of critique than there was in Kant. Apart from this factor, however, it seems to me that there is a particular reason why Kant should have become complicit in, or have contributed to, that strange homespun philosophy, admittedly at the cost of sacrificing the critical and enlightened impulses to which I have drawn your attention now so often. This reason is connected with the element of XWPWFJ6. With a block or blocks, thanks to which a whole series of realms are compartmentalized and kept in isolation from one another. People may find it convenient to have one philosophy for weekdays and another for Sundays. or to have an empirical world in which you do just as you like, and then another, quite separate world of ideals into which you can retreat for more or less edifying purposes, without any real implications in practice. Lastly, you may discern in this XWPTAFJO a reflex of the universal division of labor that ends up encroaching upon the inner economy, the personal world of the subject. Thus the subject divides itself up into a subject that knows and a subject that believes, a subject that acts and a subject that hopes, and that neatly separates the true, the beautiful and the good from one another. This has the effect that you cannot ask of the beautiful whether it is true in its innermost reality, for that would be to intrude on the comfort of the beautiful. By the same token, you cannot ask of the true whether it is also good, since this would mean disturbing the general direction of the world in which we live by making the attempt to take our ideals seriously. Take a look at the sententious poetry of Schiller, who was a Kantian and had good reason to think himself a Kantian. He wrote a number of very important theoretical essays which are without doubt the most productive contributions to the further development of Kantian aesthetics. If you look at his poetry from this point of view, you can witness this process in which these neatly separated spheres are clearly transformed into more or less independent pictures for decorative domestic purposes. For example, when he writes in a poem on women that women weave heavenly roses into earthly life / this already amounts to the idea that beauty or utopia, which he quite rightly associates with the erotic, has no binding authority. In other words, nothing is really left of this utopia that is embodied in those aspects of life that have not been entirely domesticated, but a kind of ornament, a kind of illusion that helps to make the prosaic and banal life of the workaday world a little more bearable, but must on no account attempt to change it. All that remains are the heavenly roses that are woven into it, almost as if utopia or the idea of the beautiful were a sort of transcendental funeral parlor. This element is already implicit in Kantian philosophy itself. I believe it is quite useful to point these things out, since this is usually not done in the normal course of education. On the one hand, you will have been told at school about classical literature and classical philosophy. They will have been represented to you as something exemplary, authoritative and even miraculous. On the other hand, as independent, thinking people, you will have noticed that there is something fishy somewhere. But it is just as misguided to be blindly in awe of traditional cultural achievements as it is to condemn them all out of hand on the grounds that they are obsolete or out of tune with the spirit of our age. If such achievements are condemned today, it is because they incorporate this element of untruth that I have been attempting to show you by examining their central core, their genuine philosophical substance. As I have indicated, the essential component of this corrupting tendency that is implicit in the meaning of Kantian philosophy from the outset appears to me to arise from the circumstance that the disaggregated elements constitute separate realms, like countries on a map, lying contiguously, but independently of one another. An image that Kant constantly uses by way of illustration. These separate realms have no authority over one another. The ideal only has power over life in the shape of duty, that is, in the shape of a completely formal principle that, because it is formal, can be interpreted at will. Although that was undoubtedly the last thing in Kant's mind, it can be transformed at will into the famous or notorious dictates of the moment, that is to say, the demand that everyone should do his duty, as far as is possible, at the point where he happens to be and in the situation in life he has been assigned. 2. In other words, people have to satisfy all the heteronymous demands that are made upon them. I should like to say in more general terms, even though strictly speaking it does not belong in this lecture course, that the problem of the relation between duty and freedom, terms that are basically conflated by Kant in the practical philosophy, is left completely unresolved in the critique of practical reason. The position is much the same in the critique of pure reason with the epistemological model of this problem, namely the relation of universal and particular, of a priori and the contingent, the empirical. By the same token, however, experience is not binding upon the ideals. That is to say, they are immune to criticism, they are suspended, as has been said, inalienably from the heavens three, although at the same time I can never quite rid myself of the idea that these ideals are like the famous herrings hanging from the ceiling that people are only allowed to snatch at, and that these ideals are never subjected to productive criticism, an interactive exchange at the hands of living experience. This does not emerge clearly in the critique of pure reason, but if you were to examine the principles of Kant's teachings on jurisprudence, in all their unprecedented rigor, teachings that have been derived from this idealism, you would very quickly perceive how lacking in experience such an ethics really is, and how open it is to exploitation for repressive purposes. This lack of authority can also be related to the fictional quality that I have been at pains to emphasize. This refers to the fact that we have knowledge neither of the true reality, nor of the true reality. And corresponding to this fictional quality we find the same process of the neutralization of culture in Kant. This neutralization is structural and can be seen in the pure lack of purposiveness of the beautiful that cuts off beauty from the sphere of knowledge, on the one hand, and from pure objectivity on the other. That is to say, it is cut off from total determination by the laws of causality which operate in the realm of true knowledge, while for its part the latter is made completely independent of the interventions of freedom, of the realm of practice. At this point there really is a pre-established harmony between the neutralization that has been characteristic of culture in the history of the 150 years following Kant and a tendency that is actually expressed in his philosophy, even though, in contrast to this, the idea of culture in Kant himself is still conceived of as the realization of reason. In this respect too, Kant finds himself, as I have remarked on more than one occasion, at a watershed of bourgeois consciousness. In a sense he provides the model for a habit of thought that has been widespread in normal bourgeois consciousness down to our own day. This is that curious synthesis of skepticism and dogmatism that each and every one of you will probably have experienced during your youth and from your family circumstances. It is, incidentally, a combination that does not fit badly with Kant himself since his philosophy represents a forced alliance of Humean skepticism and the dogmatism of classical rationalism. By skepticism I mean basically the bourgeois gesture that expresses the idea, well, what is truth? And which presumably likes nothing in the New Testament better than the passage when Pilate asks that very question, what is truth? 5. We should note that the only purpose of this question is to exclude every theoretical authority, every authoritative intervention of thought from the realm of experience. This was an attitude that made its contribution to the readiness of the bourgeoisie to swallow fascism and other forms of totalitarianism. On the other hand, however, certain ideas are supposed to remain inviolate and to be immune to all criticism. Such ideas remain dogmatic. they must not be touched. These two elements, the doubt that anything can be true and the unquestioned authority of norms that are regarded simply as givens within existing reality, this situation corresponds fairly precisely to the division that is rooted in Kant's philosophy. I have tried at least to point out these things to you. It is my belief that they have not been fully spelled out in this way in the literature on Kant because Kant criticism, insofar as it has a social dimension, has focused on the concept of duty and the disguised theology it contains, but not on these aspects of Kant that I actually think much more important. I have only emphasized this to prepare the way for a discussion of a question to which I said at the very start of this course I would try and provide you with some sort of answer. 6. In the light of these tendencies, you should note, that are not inherent in Kant's own consciousness, but what we might call ideas that have thrived in his shadow. The question we must ask is this: what is it that explains the authority of Kant? An authority that has established itself in the tradition in a completely different way, for to assert that Kant possessed all these features and that in all these respects he had succumbed to ideas characteristic of the history of the bourgeoisie after him, does not of course even begin to explain the unprecedented authority of his philosophy. That authority consists in an element through which Kant is transcended, if you will permit me the expression. That is to say, an element thanks to which Kant elevated himself above the prevailing consciousness of his age and that enabled him to tap a level of experience that had not really been accessible to consciousness before him. This is the phenomenon or aspect of Kantian philosophy usually referred to in the idiom of Sunday phraseology as Kantian depth, though of course we must note how this concept of depth has come down in the world. To cite one example, Marcus, the old Kantian and late Orthodox thinker, entitled one of his rather absurd books From the Depths of Knowledge 7, a title that condemns itself. By depth he meant simply that what Kant reveals is not knowledge but instead the preconditions for the possibility of knowledge, that is to say, the transcendental mechanism. If that were the case, then any theory of knowledge would appear deep when juxtaposed to any actual knowledge. But might we not then be justified in asking whether in reality every piece of knowledge that throws light on something, every piece of knowledge that genuinely illuminates something, is not deeper than such an analysis of the machinery that is supposed to explain how such knowledge comes about? If we are to take the claims of Kantian philosophy at all seriously, we cannot possibly be satisfied with such a concept of depth. It is clear, furthermore, and I should like to take the opportunity of saying something not just about the meaning of depth in Kant, but also about the concept of depth per se, that as it is generally used in Germany there can be no doubt that the concept of depth has had a catastrophic effect. This is because it is irrationalist and hostile to enlightenment. According to such a concept, thinking can only be deep if it refers to forces that lie beyond reason. To put it mildly, then, it stands in flagrant contradiction to the explicit intentions of Kant's philosophy. Kant would have retorted that the deepest foundation of his philosophy is in fact reason, that reason is the element unifying it in all its aspects and that anything that has claims to greater depth than reason cannot be contemplated. In fact, he was quite consistent here, and in his practical philosophy he was adamant in his rejection of the catastrophic concept of depth as something that could be combined with the irrational. In fact, he designated reason as the sole legitimate source of right action. An action is only good if it is performed in accordance with the law of morality, and the law of morality is basically nothing but reason itself, as far as it determines our actions. Kant did not admit the existence of any concept of lawfulness other than what is to be found in reason and its immanent laws. In contrast to this, the so-called irrational forces that have been glorified in the name of depth, especially in Germany, with such catastrophic consequences, are only to be found in Kant under the appellation of effects, and here he is following the rationalist tradition, particularly as it is expressed in the philosophy of Spinoza. These effects are things that have power over me. Insofar as they have power, I am not free. They are supposed to be external to me, something merely empirical. For that reason his philosophy resists them with a determination that verges on the callous. Incidentally, I would not wish to hide the fact that his aversion to this entire sphere of experience has its reactionary side, something of the Hedges of the 18th century. It is responsible for certain formalistic elements of his aesthetics that unfortunately I cannot go into today. At all events, what is usually referred to as deep in the German tradition is something he would have described as heteronymous. Horkheimer once said that when people say that something is deep, what is generally meant is that human beings should not prosper too much in life. It is better that they should suffer, and this justification of suffering, the preference for the negativity of existence, the duplication of this negativity of existence, is what characterizes the concept of depth that is so fashionable among us. This concept of depth, which we have good reason to call masochistic, is in fact contradicted by Kantian philosophy as a whole. This is confirmed by the positive use of the concept of externality in the chapter on the amphibole of the concepts of reflection and its apparent repudiation of the concept of interiority that is generally associated with that of depth. It has often been pointed out, and with some justice, that Kant's philosophy is deeply imbued with Protestantism and particularly with this concept of interiority. But we might object that in his hands interiority is intensified to the point where precious little is left of its core meaning, namely, the individual soul. In consequence, what survives of interiority is merely the abstract unity of reason, which, admittedly, is purified of all externality. At the same time, Kant relegates everything we generally associate with interiority to the realm of the external. It is demoted to the level of mere psychology and hence heteronomy, so that we end up with interiority itself becoming the object of criticism. It is turned into something external, namely, mere logical determinacy which lacks the wealth of interiority, but which precisely because of this radicality of the concept actually transcends interiority or at least finds itself strenuously opposed to it. Even though it is perfectly true that the turn towards inwardness stems from the Protestant tradition, as do other features such as the rigorous antithesis between belief and knowledge, it simply will not do to reduce Kant, or indeed any other important philosopher, to his so-called origins. If you can learn anything from what I have to tell you, perhaps it really should be to emancipate yourselves from this question of origins. By this I mean you have to free yourselves from the illusion that you have understood a problem better once you know that it comes from this or that source. It is undisputed that the tradition of Protestant interiority is the source of the rigor with which Kant separated belief from knowledge, and also of his concept of duty. What is overlooked in the process is that the concept of the individual as the soul in need of salvation, which is the idea underlying this traditional Protestant concept of interiority, is dissolved by the development of the concept, that is to say, by the Kantian critique of reason, so that what we are left with is the very antithesis of what had been originally intended. Of course, we must add, and I have no wish to conceal from you the complexity of Kant's argument, that the radical separation of idea and phenomenon, of phenomena and noumena, is objectively not entirely alien to the concept of tragedy that is generally associated with that of depth. This means that the finite is defined simply as the finite, as indeed is death. The meaninglessness of merely empirical existence and the fact that the empirical as such is finite, is separated, XWPC, from its own meaning, has been made into a structural feature of this finitude and in a sense may be said to have been ratified by it. In this respect Schiller, whose concept of tragedy descends directly from Kant's philosophy, and who put this conception to work in his own plays, was an authentic Kantian. This concept of the tragic in its Kantian form asserts the complete incompatibility of the world of appearances in which we live as finite beings with the world of the idea that overtaxes us in principle and ensures that we come to grief. This concept of tragedy has a long German tradition in which tragedy is directly equated with depth. With the passage of time, however, this notion of the tragic has been exposed as superficial. That is to say, it amounts to the declaration that its meaninglessness is its true meaning and to the belief that we are in the presence of metaphysics, that the meaninglessness is a necessity, something that must be so and not otherwise. The sense of satisfaction that derives from the way in which the soul soars into the air while the body is left behind like a corpse that rests upon the chair, simply blinds us to the truth that depth remains what it really is, namely what Hegel called the consciousness of distress, 8 that is to say, the reflexive form of suffering. It is my view that it is high time for a critique of the category of tragedy, not as a sublime and permanently valid expression of the human spirit, but as an heirloom from the stock of possessions of the middle classes. So that is what I wanted to say to you about the concept of depth in Kant. In other words, that it should be distinguished from traditional ideas about depth of feeling, depth of interiority and all such matters. This remains the case even though in this thesis of the irreconcilability of appearances and the idea, in what we have described as Kant's anti-utopian streak, this depth does meet up again with the conventional idea. Furthermore, what I am giving you is not just an interpretation of Kant, but what might be termed a plan for a phenomenology of the concept of depth in philosophy. In other words, an exposition of what might be covered by the idea of depth. You must be clear in your own minds that in Kant what we mean by depth has nothing to do with psychological depth because the mere term psychoanalysis is one that people in general still find shocking. It is well known that some people are so shocked by it that they instinctively feel the need to produce a psychosynthesis to oppose to psychoanalysis. This is why the attempt has been made to replace the concept of psychoanalysis with depth psychology. It sounds more reputable and it may be thought to contain something of the crypto-philosophy of depth 9 to the understanding of which I hope to have made some contribution. Whatever the situation may be with regard to nomenclature, the depth that Kant aspires to is not that of psychology, or the depths of the unconscious. If we were to misconstrue Kant by arguing that he had penetrated to the depths of the soul, as a great psychologist may well succeed in doing, this would be as alien to Kant as the common or garden metaphysics of depth which I have been discussing with you. For all psychology in Kant, and this brings me to the specific view of psychology contained in the Critique of Pure Reason is no more than a science of psychology, and if I may speak, as it were, topologically, in terms of a concept of depth, it would not even be present, be localized, in the field in which something like depth could be said to be situated. So-called depth psychology, too, would be nothing more than an empirical science in his eyes. Incidentally, we should note the curious hostility to psychology that pervades German thought. It argues that psychology is an empirical science, while the soul, because of its interiority, is removed from the realm of the empirical. It follows that psychology must be a reprehensible and evil science. This hostility to psychology goes down to Husserl, and even beyond Husserl, to Heidegger, and has all sorts of ramifications, right down to modern educational theory and God knows what else. It is very likely that this hostility is related to Kant's own fear of contact with the sphere of factual reality in the realm of the soul. Furthermore, if I may anticipate, you should be clear in your minds that Kantian philosophy shares this phobia. However, Kant's philosophy really does stand on a dividing line in this respect too. As philosophy, that is to say, as a discipline concerned with absolute validity or truth, it excludes psychology as a legitimate source of insight, albeit not completely. On the other hand, it is Kant's great merit, and this is his achievement when compared to the English philosophers, that he was the first to realize that the realm of the soul, which in the tradition of German psychology was thought to be situated outside psychology, in fact belongs within it. He realized that there are facts of the soul, and that such facts of the soul are facts, much like other facts, and not veritas. Nowadays, there is a certain abuse of the ambiguity of the I of the kind we have variously observed in Kant. By ambiguity I mean the fact that Kant cannot escape from the psychological dimension of the one, while at the same time he hypostatizes its logical form. By abuse I mean that the categories or forms of thought that are supposed to refer only to the intelligible I are used to refer to our knowledge of the actual, empirical I. Here too, Kant is not wholly without blame, since he taught, in a bold and very convoluted argument that can scarcely be reconstructed nowadays, that the empirical one, that is, the character that each individual human being happens to possess, is a repository of freedom, that is to say, it is a self that it has essentially given to itself. But in the first instance the relation of the Critique of Pure Reason to psychology is this: on the one hand, the analysis of the I, the analysis of the subject, is sharply distinguished from the study of psychology. We are told that what psychology can teach us, namely, the idea of the soul and whatever it contains, is identical neither with the pure forms to which the Critique of Reason can be applied, nor with their concrete content. Instead, the soul is said to be a purely empirical matter. He goes on to say, however, or at least to imply, that the essential determinants of the life of the soul as it exists are to be kept within the confines of empirical science. We must add, however, that at this point his argument breaks off prematurely. Next time I should like to bring together all the observations that follow from this and relate them to the concept of depth. I shall then attempt to give you some at least of the important arguments to be found in the Kantian critique of rational psychology, that is to say, of the psychology that attempted to make absolute, to hypostatize, various psychological categories by inferring them from pure reason. We shall see then that Kant's position is very much that of modern psychology, rather than of the obscurantists. This means that he treats the categories of psychology as empirical categories, even though, for that very reason, he excludes them from those of philosophy. The effect of this is that the arguments concerning his own depth, transcendental depth, must not be confused with arguments concerning psychological depth. I shall trace out the implications of this line of thought because I wish to confront you with its limitations, in particular with the question, what is the meaning of depth if it belongs neither to metaphysics nor to logic nor even to psychology? I believe that this will give us a crucial insight into the nature of Kant's philosophy. Lecture 18, July 1, 1959 Psychology. I should like to remind you that in our discussions of the concept of depth and the meaning of talk about depth in the Critique of Pure Reason, we made the discovery that this depth was not psychological in nature, even though it involves immersion in the sphere of subjectivity. This may well strike you as very illuminating at first blush, and you will all have heard something or other about the non-psychological nature of the general thrust of Kant's thought and his preoccupation with a priori knowledge. But when you immerse yourselves in the text, it turns out to be anything but obvious. For example, when you read that schematism is a hidden mechanism of the soul, it is very difficult to conceive of this in other than psychological terms. The position is similar in the Critique of Practical Reason when Kant describes the coercion and sense of obligation that emanate from conscience. To here modern depth psychology has even confirmed his insights, since today we know that what we may regard as the psychological counterpart of the Kantian concept, namely the superego, in fact exerts a kind of coercive psychological force that corresponds entirely to the effect that Kant ascribes to the moral law. Thus when you resolve to face up to the full implications of the question of Kant's relation to psychology, you will be led back to what I had already said on a number of occasions, but you will see it in a new light. This is that as soon as you try to visualize what is meant by depth in Kant, you will find yourselves in the realms of facticity, of factual realities, or, in this instance, facts of the soul, concrete psychological elements, but with a distinction, as we shall see in due course, that the entire Kantian line of argument attempts to pull itself up by its own bootstraps. What I mean is that it owes its existence in great measure to these psychological or other material factors, but, at the same time, it is forced to interpret them in such a way that their factual nature is ignored. At all events, it is undoubtedly true that Kant's intentions are hostile to psychology. It is likewise true that the difference between him and Hume is that you have the same turn towards the subject in both thinkers, but that in Kant it cannot be thought of in psychological terms. You can imagine this for yourselves. It has its own underlying motivation, that is to say, it is not a kind of arbitrary metaphysicizing act on Kant's part. Rather, it reflects the fact that the real psychological mechanisms that Hume refers to, above all, those of association, that is, of the resemblance of experiences to one another or their contiguity 3, are based on an assumption that is not made explicit in Hume's treatise. This is the case even though they have been derived from what might be called experimental psychological observations. The assumption I am referring to concerns the unified consciousness which binds these associations together. In other words, when Hume criticizes the concept of the self, which we are also concerned with in Kant, and dismisses it as a dogmatic prejudice, he is guilty of a certain naivety, since without a concept of the self it is not possible to conceive of the factors that it describes as psychological and that are supposed to replace the concept of the self. To put it another way, however our consciousness is conceived, if there are no unifying factors, if there is nothing to unify our experiences in the way that Hume describes when he talks about associations, then the concept loses its meaning. The distinction between the anti-psychological Kant and the psychological Hume at this point is not one of ideology. It derives from Kant's greater insistence on the data under scrutiny, that you cannot reduce the self to matters of fact that depend for their existence upon a concept of the self, for Kant's repudiation of psychology is documented in countless passages as early as the Critique of Pure Reason, but with incomparably greater bluntness and explicitness in the Critique of Practical Reason. It became significantly more marked in the course of Kant's development, as can be seen from the fact that the changes introduced in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason are largely concerned with psychology. This rejection of psychology has two consequences that may be thought of as dialectically interrelated. I should like to discuss them with you now. The first is that a kind of demotion of psychology, and with it of all inner realities, is implicit in the fact that Kant develops the idea of a priori thinking in such a way as to assert that it is subjective in nature, but that it is independent of all psychologizing. This curious demotion of psychology begins in the Critique of Pure Reason and has survived as one of the most influential features of Kant's philosophy, one that has left its mark on German philosophy as a whole. This even holds good for the ontological and phenomenological trends in German thought that have explicitly set themselves up in opposition to Kantianism. I once described this situation by saying that in Germany the soul is too refined to have anything to do with psychology. Psychology has for its part insisted on its scientific status and separateness from philosophy, much as philosophy liked to think of itself as a Weltanschauung distinct from psychology. It responded to my rebuke by asserting that it wanted to have nothing to do with the soul. It is not difficult, and Nietzsche developed this idea on several occasions, to discern a theological legacy in this aspect of Kant's philosophy and the German tradition as a whole. That is to say, the soul must be sacrosanct. The soul must not be allowed to be involved in experience or to be contaminated by the contingent nature of experience. This is to protect the attributes of indivisibility, identity and immortality that were first formulated by Plato in the Phaedo and subsequently passed via Augustine into the entire Christian tradition. Thus this German philosophical tradition makes a sharp distinction between itself and psychology, and finds offensive everything that smells of psychology. Nevertheless, to be fair, it must be pointed out that for all this strange fear of contamination characteristic of German philosophy, it has long since become far too sophisticated to make use of the concept of the soul, which in a sense it regards as too empirical. You will be aware that the latest attempts to gain freedom from psychology, and at the same time to preserve for philosophy categories that actually owe their existence to psychology, is the philosophy of Heidegger. In Heidegger's philosophy the term state of mind, Befindlichkeit, refers to a whole series of attributes that form part of the actual, concrete, psychic life of human beings. Despite this they are treated as if they were characteristics of pure being, sign as being, which latter only possesses the peculiarity of revealing itself in a specific form, namely that of being there. Das and V. This has the effect that where psychological matters are referred to, they are transformed at a stroke into something that purports to testify to a metapsychological realm. This entire phenomenon is responsible for tendencies in German philosophy and the German intellectual tradition that are inimical to every shade of enlightenment. At the beginning of this course of lectures I told you that the Enlightenment was a failure in Germany. 6. This shows itself nowhere as vividly as in the attitude towards psychology, a subject which has largely been left to the mercies of the obscurantists. The attempt to isolate subjectivity from the empirical categories of psychology from which it draws its substance and to define it as a superior mode of being leads to a denial of the instinctual elements that are part of the subject and that constitute the genetic precondition of all knowledge. For we know today that the ego principle, that is to say, the rationality that scrutinizes reality, is actually a form of energy that has been diverted from the reservoir of drives in our possession in the interests of self-preservation. This instinctual element, which underlies every act of cognition in one way or another, as everyone can observe in himself as a knowing subject, is denied and resisted. This denial involves an act of repression, such as is found in the glorification of self-control, Haltung, a particular kind of demeanor that allegedly arises from the direct passage of metaphysical experiences into one's everyday mode of experience, while the psychological study of how this process is supposed to work is dispensed with. For example, I am aware of the situation in psychiatry, in German psychiatry, where schizophrenia is sometimes described with the Heideggerian term loss of being, or even as a lack of self-control, as if a military bearing had priority over psychology and might even protect people from psychotic disturbances. But at the same time I should like to emphasize that Kant's own theory of the soul and his critique of Wolff's rational theory of the soul call a halt to all these tendencies, even though they may derive their authority from the anti-psychological tradition that goes back to his own philosophy. In this respect too, as in many others, Kant represents a sort of watershed. That is to say, he does indeed try to establish a sphere, one which I can only describe as a transcendental sphere, that is supposed to be distinct from logic or metaphysics or psychology. On the other hand, however, thanks to the construction of this sphere, which is indeed the most important task still remaining to us in this introductory course of lectures, the sphere of psychology may be said to have been liberated. Precisely because the actual psychic life of mankind is deemed not to be the legitimate source of the truth to which reflections upon the transcendental subject are dedicated, this has the effect in Kant of making that life of the soul the object of empirical science. It thus becomes the very opposite of what has been made of it by the irrationalist tradition in Germany. We may add without exaggerating that the parts of Kant that can be seen to be the most advanced expression of the Enlightenment are those in which, despite his radical separation of the transcendental sphere from that of psychology, he turns psychology into an empirical science and in which he largely concedes that the realm of psychology is governed by the laws of cause and effect. It is this that I should like to turn to now. What I have in mind is to take a look at the chapter on the paralogisms. These passages were neglected for a long time, but they have perhaps achieved a new topicality today because of their enlightened character. 7. What they are concerned with is a critique of so-called rational psychology, that is to say, the attempt to derive the soul as an entity, as a unified, self-identical, indestructible being from pure thought by the processes of logic. This was the kind of project that could be found in Leibniz's philosophy and its systematic formulation by Wolff, and this is the object of Kant's critique. Kant's fundamental idea here is formulated programmatically, as it were, in the introduction to Chapter 1 of Book 2 of the Transcendental Dialectic, and I should like to read you a few sentences from there and at the same time make use of them to catch up on a few things concerning the internal structure of Kant's philosophy that I may not have explained to you as clearly as it was my duty to do. The following general remark may, at the outset, aid us in our scrutiny of this kind of argument, that is to say, of the paralogism. A paralogism is a fallacy that believes that it is possible to infer substantive knowledge of one kind or another simply from pure concepts. 8. I do not know an object merely in that I think, but only in so far as I determine a given intuition with respect to the unity of consciousness in which all thought consists. Consequently, I do not know myself through being conscious of myself as thinking, but only when I am conscious of the intuition of myself as determined with respect to the function of thought. 9. In a sense we are concerned here with two concepts of the self that must be kept apart, because of their different reference, if we are to understand what Kant intends in this passage. In the first place, we have the self of which I am conscious when I think. It is really nothing other than our good old synthetic unity of apperception, the I think that accompanies all my representations. As you will recollect, we said of this self that it really just means that all my representations come together in the unity of my personal consciousness. This process of becoming conscious of myself as someone thinking, however, has nothing of psychology about it. It means nothing but the simple objective fact that some sort of a connection between experiences can arise only if they flow into an identical stream of experiences, as Husserl would phrase it. However, this pure flow of experiences, purified of all empirical characteristics, this purely abstract identity, tells me nothing about me in the second sense. This sense is the idea that the self is a specific thing, a soul with this or that substance and some characteristics and qualities or other. The fallacy that Kant now wishes to demolish once and for all is the idea that it is possible to take this formal account of the subject as a unity that brings together that subject's experiences and deduce from it the actual existence of a substantive self, whereas the truth is that the concept of substance stands in need of intuitions if it is to be fulfilled. That is to say, it would have to contain specific real contents, specific experiences. We should note that Kant realized perfectly clearly and without panicking that the concept of intuition or the empirical would have to be applied to so-called inner experience, to what I know of myself, just as much as to external reality. This means that what I apprehend in myself under the heading of the principium individuationis, to wit, as a temporal, actual experience, is just as much a factual reality, an empirical intuition, as any external intuition that I happen to have of objects in space, my immediate self-consciousness of some concrete conditions or other in which I happen to find myself as an experience of something. It has a subject matter and substance of its own, and is therefore in no wise to be distinguished from my experiences of the external world. I should also like to discuss this passage for a different reason, one that is not quite appropriate at this point, but which at least gives me the opportunity to emphasize something more strongly than I have done up to now. It says here, I do not know an object merely in that I think, but only in so far as I determine a given intuition with respect to the unity of consciousness in which all thought consists. In other words, then, one factor that determines my experiences is that they are subsumed into the unity of my consciousness, and that they are my experiences and not those of another person. They enter into relations with all the other experiences of this particular individual subject, thanks to which they acquire their meaning. Now it seems to me that I have used this concept of unity with a certain naivety, as a matter of course, without really thinking about it and without saying what ought necessarily to be said. I should have said that this concept of unity is one of Kant's constitutive concepts, we might almost say, one of the most fundamental experiences that exist. You know that the concept of synthesis plays a great role in Kant and that, as an activity, synthesis consists simply in creating a synthesis out of a diversity. Concepts like synthesis have a very different complexion in different philosophies, and it may be of use to you to be able to identify the specific complexion of the Kantian notion. Synthesis in Kant does not mean what may be suggested to us unconsciously by the subsequent philosophy of Hegel. That is to say, it is not a mediation between opposites whose identity is defined from within. Synthesis in Kant means merely that a manifold, an assemblage of diverse things, is brought together in a unity. It is actually the decisive factor by means of which Kant may be said to have signed up to the tradition of a philosophy concerned to dominate nature. The foe of this thinking, if I may be permitted to exaggerate somewhat, is the diverse, the many, that which is opposed to the autonomy of a self-controlling rationality. This includes the diffuse that always captivates us precisely because it is not uniform, because it is ambiguous. We are familiar with the diffuse from the countless myths in which elemental beings of a hybrid nature hover between man and beast, nature and man, shimmering and enticing us to follow them. In contrast, unity is the category of something like consciousness of self. It could almost be said that in Kant everything of metaphysical substance that is opposed to diversity has been gathered together in this idea of unity, of whatever is identical with itself. This is confirmed by the way in which this concept of unity plays a decisive role in the critique of pure reason, and the categories themselves all emanate from unity, to wit, the unity of consciousness, while the concept of unity is never discussed or deduced from anything else. Instead, it represents the canon by which everything else can be judged. That knowledge is one, and the fact that this one has primacy over the many may be said to be the metaphysical premise of Kantian philosophy. It is also the point at which Kant concurs with the Enlightenment in the broadest possible sense, as indeed with early Greek thought and with Christian thought in its entirety. This emphasis on unity at the expense of diversity is a feature of the tradition that Kant adopts without reflection. I would say that the operations that lead to an escape from this kind of thought, and of which I have attempted to give you at least an inkling, are all connected with the possibility of thinking critically about the concept of unity, which is inseparably connected to the concept of the first principle. At the same time, and this characterizes it as something I have described as a fundamental experience of the critique of pure reason, this concept of unity cannot be said to be a mere abstraction that has been applied retrospectively. Kantian unity, and this may be seen as an aspect of the profundity of Kant's philosophy, is not a mere homogenization that results from depriving a mass of diverse, varied things of their differentiating features, while retaining the one thing they have in common. This unity is understood by Kant to be modeled on the unity of consciousness itself. It is in a sense prior to all knowledge in the shape of the identity of the subject that is then correlated to the unity of any object that manifests itself. To that extent it is not so much the product of knowledge as its essence. If you like, we might say that in this sense the critique of pure reason culminates in the thesis that unity is not something produced by consciousness, but it is the essence of knowledge that arises from a consciousness, which itself is nothing other than unity. The I think that accompanies all my representations means nothing but the unity that combines to make all my representations mine, and not those of another human subject. Thus unity is truly the metaphysical center to which everything else is attached. Put another way, thinking and unity are actually the same thing in Kant. I believe that he would have accepted a statement along these lines, even though it instantly throws up the question of how such a unity manages to do anything, and the even more difficult problem of how such a unity is in fact mediated by the many to which it relates. Now, the organ, the mediating category by means of which this absolute unity is related to the plurality of things is the unity of personal consciousness, without which no representations are possible. This is because it consists in the plurality, that is, in the many, in the experiences that combine to make me into a subject and to form such a unity simply because they are my experiences. Its function is the mediating factor, the only possible mediating factor between the hypostatized unity and the plurality that is the deepest reason for the privileged position ascribed by Kant to the subject, namely, to personal consciousness, the unity of consciousness, about which we have learnt in the passage we have just been examining. As for the individual arguments against the paralogisms, the fallacies, even though I believe that I have sufficiently explained the principle to you, I should like to illustrate it with a few characteristic models. For example, we can look at the concept of substance. You must bear in mind that in Kant substance is a category, that is to say, substance is not an existent being as such, but that whenever we speak of substance we are in the presence of a necessity of thought that is grounded in the transcendental mechanism of thought. As such, however, this mechanism of thought only yields valid knowledge if it refers to something we can intuit, if it has a content, but it degenerates into vacuity, baselessness and empty assertion if it has nothing to get its teeth into. In all judgments I am the determining subject of that relation which constitutes the judgment. That the I that thinks, can be regarded always as sub act, and is something which does not belong to thought as a mere predicate, must be granted. It is an apodeictic and indeed identical proposition. But it does not mean that I, as object, am for myself a self-subsistent being or substance. The latter statement goes very far beyond the former, and demands for its proof data which are not to be met with in thought, and perhaps, in so far as I have regard to the thinking self merely as such, are more than I shall ever find in it. 10. This final sentence may be said to be a lethal blow to the concept of the substantiality of the soul because it amounts to the following statement: in a sense I can know myself as an absolute sense as a thinking subject, as the thinking that accompanies all my representations. I am the necessary and indispensable precondition of every external and internal perception. But this does not mean that anything at all is said about me as an object, and thus as an empirical one, let alone as anything absolutely enduring. The fact that without the form of this I no contents can be thought does not imply that it can become an object, can be reified. It does not mean that we may think of it as we might think of it once it has been filled with data. Since the data are determined by time, since they change and are modified by time, it could be said, and this is implicit in Kant's argument, that these data do not empower us to grant the soul the status of absolute being, presiding over the changes in its concrete contents. Its concrete manifestations which I perceive within myself in the shape of internal intuition. This assertion represents a damaging blow to the idea of the substantiality of the soul. An even more damaging one is perhaps contained in the following passage that I should like to read you because it marks the point, and after all we have said about Kant I regard this as a piece of fair play that I owe him, because it comes closest to the point we have reached in our deliberations concerning the relation of the one to the many and in general concerning that of the transcendental self to the individual self. That the I of apperception, and therefore the I in every act of thought, is one, and cannot be resolved into a plurality of subjects, and consequently signifies a logically simple subject, is something already contained in the very concept of thought, and is therefore an analytic proposition. 11. Here Kant quite unambiguously asserts what I have told you about and what you will have difficulty finding so clearly stated elsewhere in the Critique of Pure Reason. This is that the sentence I think only has a meaning if it refers to the singularity of a specific self whose experiences are connected and are functionally interrelated by the fact that they are his experiences and not those of anyone else. We may note in passing that this admission contains the implication that the attempt that we find in so many interpretations of Kant to draw a sharp line between subjectivity and psychology of every kind is simply not tenable. For by making such a singularity the foundation instead of a universality or a plurality, Kant already points to a factual existence and even to an already constituted individual existence. But this does not mean that the thinking I is a simple substance. That proposition would be synthetic. This means it would be a proposition that only comes into being by synthesizing a series of different elements, that is to say, by combining intuited elements into a unity, while the substantial cannot be conceived of in a formal unity without regard to its possible content. The concept of substance always relates to intuitions which cannot in me be other than sensible, and which therefore lie entirely outside the field of the understanding and its thought. But it is of this thought that we are speaking when we say that the I in thought is simple. 12. This statement contains nothing less than the admission that the identity of the subject, personal identity, is so formal that it almost reduces itself to the tautology that the experiences of a singular subject are his experiences and not those of anyone else. But it insists that beyond that the expression of identity does not imply something like a substantial identity of human beings with themselves. And this conclusion, we may say, really only differs by a hair's breadth from Hume's criticism of the concept of the self. In any discussion of empirical psychology, psychology as science, you would really need a magnifying glass to see the difference between empiricism and the critique of pure reason. It has to be said that it has taken a long time to digest this last proposition. It has taken a very long time really to liberate ourselves from the mythology of the identity of the soul and to realize that this bond of identity is so tenuous that quantity reverses into quality. I mean by this that when we think of ourselves as having a permanent identity, we mean something so formal that, actually, we do not mean anything at all. Proust's entire cycle of novels could be said to be a single magnificent attempt to portray the non-identity of the psychological subject within its identity. And if you are interested in the original experience underlying the thought and the ideas of Gottfried Benn, you will encounter there a similar phenomenon why all of these very advanced things can already be found in the Critique of Pure Reason. I would not like to let the opportunity slip to point out that one element of the greatness of the Critique of Pure Reason is that a whole series of its speculative propositions that were well in advance of its age, have now either been absorbed into the individual sciences or else have been reflected in major works of art. Lecture 19, July 1, 23 959. The concept of the transcendental. 3. I should like to begin by taking up the thread of our examination of Kant's views on the so-called rational psychology, which we have been looking at as a preliminary to making secure our understanding of the concept of depth and transcendental philosophy. I should like briefly to discuss a few more passages from the chapter on the paralogism so as to give you the core of the argument. Here, as elsewhere, I am of course acting in accordance with the principle of paradigmatic learning. This means that by interpreting particularly crucial passages of key significance, I believe that I can not only focus on the essential features of Kant's thinking but also enable you to extrapolate from these passages to others elsewhere in the argument. What I want you to understand is that you should make the effort to apply what you have learned from the interpretations I have given to other passages that you have studied for yourselves. So what I am concerned with here is the proposition about my identity with myself. Kant states, the proposition, that in all the manifold of which I am conscious I am identical with myself, is likewise implied in the concepts themselves, and is therefore an analytical proposition. The unity of personal consciousness is indeed identity in the most abstract possible sense. It means that all the contents of consciousness, all the facts of consciousness are to be referred to this self, this individuality, that is identical and present in them. But this identity of the subject, of which I can be conscious in all my representations, does not concern any intuition of the subject, whereby it is given as an object, and cannot therefore signify the identity of the person, if by that is understood the consciousness of the identity of one's own substance, as a thinking being, whatever changes it may undergo. No mere analysis of the proposition I think will suffice to prove such a proposition. For that we should require various synthetic judgments, based upon given intuition. One you see here as in a test tube the prototype of the arguments that constantly recur in the so-called negative part, the critical part in the narrower sense, of the Critique of Pure Reason. We might describe the position simply by saying that the fallacies of reason or the reasons for the mistakes of reason are always to be found in the one circumstance. This is that something that is merely subjective, a merely reflexive concept, a form, mistakes itself for something objective, something independent of all the specific facts of experience, and it does so because all the elements of the knowledge of substantive contents require these subjective, formal components. The entire proof of the antinomies, of the paralogisms as well as the amphiboles, all the things that Kant has criticized, that he has smashed, all say the one thing, again and again. This is that something subjective, namely, the form, which possesses validity only in relation to a matching content, and fulfills any sort of objectivizing function only in relation to this content, that this subjective element claims to be objective. We might say that this is the pattern of the amphiboles, the pattern of the confusion on which all the fallacies of reason are based. And what you can take home with you is what I have already told you. This is that there is a sense in which the critique of pure reason fits into the general movement of the Enlightenment. For as in André Gide's play about Oedipus, the Enlightenment states, and here it goes against all mythological ideas, all metaphysical underpinnings, that what you think of as an existing, objective thing is in reality none other than yourself. What it comes down to is simply man and nothing besides. Thus, as I believe I already pointed out to you last time, the argument is that this formal identity of consciousness is just what it says. The fact is that all my experiences are defined as mine and not those of anyone else. They tell us nothing about the objective, substantive identity of the individual. It is not the case that this identity is permanently present in me in concrete terms. So what we have here is a confusion between the pure conceptual form of identity and a material identity, something actually existing. And finally, here is one last passage, probably the most crucial of all, from the chapter on the paralogisms, that I distinguish my own existence as that of a thinking being, from other things outside me, among them my body, is likewise an analytic proposition. For other things are such as I think to be distinct from myself. But I do not thereby learn whether this consciousness of myself would be even possible apart from things outside me through which representations are given to me, and whether, therefore, I could exist merely as a thinking being, that is without existing in human form. Point 3. I read this passage out to you with a certain muted exclamation of triumph because it is the passage in the Critique of Pure Reason where Kant directly expresses the idea that I have rather laboriously been trying to convey to you. This is the idea that all the talk of an I and all the other features that are claimed to be transcendental elements in Kant actually presuppose something like an empirical individuality. When Kant says that I could probably not exist merely as thinking being, without being a human being, in other words, without my being an object of anthropological study, or without my being an empirically determinate, factual reality, then this means that the critique of the claim to absolute a priority, to the absolute primacy of the I think that accompanies all my representations may be adjudged a success. The only difficulty, and we shall have to concern ourselves with this in what follows, is that Kant refuses here and in many other places to accept the full implications of his own assertion. Instead he leaves the matter standing with the logical priority of the I think over mere factual reality, without drawing any conclusions from the question of whether we may speak meaningfully of an I think in the absence of an actually existing I. At this juncture, then, he has indeed arrived at the insight we have been laboring over, but at the same time it fails to have any consequences for his construction of a priority. You can see here Kant's refusal of consistency, the gesture which Brecht once expressed as taking the form of, whoever says A, need not say B. You can see that this gesture is of enormous importance for its insistence that the world is fissile, that there is no reconciled unity of subject and object. However, his refusal also has its negative aspect because the theory remains inconsistent in its own terms, and so crucial parts of it become untenable. What is being said here is nothing less than that this naive self which forms the starting point of so much epistemological speculation, as we find, for example, in the English psychological philosophers, Locke and Hume, has absolutely no priority over any other notion of the self. Furthermore, this self has a content and even its physical personality cannot be simply ignored. In other words, we cannot just overlook the fact that we are dealing with a particular psychophysical being called man. It is perfectly clear that this delivers a severe blow to our ability to use as our starting point the absolute self-certainty of the self that directly apprehends some data or other, as well as all the implications of this that we have discussed in such detail. I do not wish to emphasize those things here. Instead, what I wish to stress is that the ontological primacy of the empirical person as a soul can in fact no longer be sustained as it was by rationalist psychology. That primacy turns out to be no more than what latter-day neo-Kantians would have called a merely methodological primacy, that is to say, a primacy of presentation, not a primacy that emanates from the nature of the matter in hand. I should like to make two further points to round off what we have said about the chapter on paralogisms. On the one hand, I believe that Kant's critique has made matters too easy for itself. It is too radical in one sense. This is because he offered a number of definitions relating to the world of the outer senses, the world of things, without paying heed to the fact that they could be applied just as easily to the world of the inner senses, to the psyche. You constantly come across turns of phrase that indicate that where this psychological factor is empirical, it is intangible, ephemeral, a relation between aspects, rather than something with substance. You must remember here that according to Kant, substance is a category, in other words, a form of thought that is indispensable if we are to bring order into our intuitions. If you consider, further, that the character of the phenomenal that he ascribes to the content of everything concerning the psyche applies in equal measure to external realities, then you will surely realize that Kant has failed to see that the phenomenon of reification must apply to the phenomena of the psyche too. By this I mean the phenomenon that such a relation permits specific expectations for the future and specific memories of the past, just as he had shown this to operate in the case of external objects. Cast your minds back to my detailed interpretation of a passage in the chapter on amphiboles, for which says how startling it is that a thing really consists of relations, namely, the relations between its different phenomenal aspects. The scientists would talk in terms of functional equations. Exactly the same thing might be said of inner phenomena, and indeed a pupil of Max Scheler, I believe he was called Haas, wrote a book in the 1920s in which he developed the implications of this idea. Admittedly from different philosophical assumptions. These assumptions were those of a material phenomenology, leading to talk of a psychological world of things. In other words, then, it is possible for enduring, substantial structures to develop within the economy of the psyche, the realm of the intuitions given to us in the course of experience. These structures are subject to the laws of causality, and in their turn they set up rational expectations in exactly the same way as in the case of events in the external world. Kant failed to see this possibility of objective realities in the psyche, and thus overlooked the element of truth that is after all to be found in the rationalist doctrine of the soul that he was combating. This element of truth is that there really is such a thing as personal identity, an empirical identity of the individual which takes the form of a thing-like relation between psychological phenomena, between individual modes of reaction. All this may seem to you to be mere pedantry, but what depends on it is nothing less than the category of character in psychology. Only via this route that I have sketched for you can psychology be in a position to provide a science of character. And to me at least, the development of such a science is the most important goal that psychology can aspire to. A school of psychology that postpones the establishment of a science of character to the Greek kalends, and many schools of psychology do just that, is really just fooling around in its own forecourt, instead of pressing forward to the heart of the matter, while this corrosive critique of rational psychology leaves absolutely no room for the concept of character at all. This has major implications for the Kantian system because in Kant's ethics, which is closely connected at this point to his theory of knowledge, the concept of character is defined as intelligible character, that is to say, as the cause of a person's individual actions which can, therefore, be said to be subject to the causality exercised by his character. In this sense, Kant is in complete agreement with the idea of a psychology of character. For we know that people who have a definite character, a neurosis, for example, constantly repeat specific actions of a specific type, and these actions have causes that are independent of their conscious will. For example, they repeatedly behave in such a way as to bring about their own failure in their profession because they unconsciously undermine their own activities. We call these modes of behavior character neuroses, and this describes a particular type of character. Kant sees this when he says in the Critique of Practical Reason that my individual actions are mediated with my character by causality 6 only, he adds, and this may be taken as his reply to his oversight on this point in the Critique of Pure Reason, that I originally give myself this character through an act of freedom. 7. This declaration, on which the doctrine of freedom of the Critique of Practical Reason is actually based in so far as it possesses a positive content, this declaration is completely incompatible with the idea of psychology as a science. I mean by this that anyone with the faintest notion of the psychology of character will be aware that character is formed in early childhood on the basis of specific conflicts with the surrounding world and the resolution of these conflicts. It follows that it is utterly absurd for Kant to ascribe this achievement, as he explicitly does, to the autonomous reason of the child, who has no knowledge of himself. Likewise, if you take the concept of conscience, you will discover a similar ambiguous attitude towards the insights of psychology which is very relevant in this context. At the phenomenological level, Kant gives a very satisfying account of the compulsive, inexorable and coercive features of conscience. 8. However, he goes on to claim conscience as an absolute, whereas, as Hegel would say, it is really something that is itself asserted. That is to say, it emerges from the dynamics of the psyche. And its coercive elements in particular, which are hypostatized by Kant, are in reality nothing less than the stigmata of oppression and failure. 9. These are the essential points that I wanted to convey to you in connection with Kant's critique of the psychological paralogisms. This is the point where his criticism of them goes too far and condemns itself to sterility. On the other hand, we must also say that in one respect he does not go far enough. For when Kant claims that concepts like identity, substantiality and singularity, concepts that he criticizes, can only be said to have an application if they refer to phenomena, to specific intuitions, he ought really to make the same claim with regard to the idea of the synthetic unity of apperception. For this is the foundation that underpins the transcendental philosophy, namely the simple I think. Now, he does in fact do this up to a point. He says that this transcendental subject must not be understood to be an empirical reality, but that it is meaningful only if it is filled with intuition. However, he is not entirely consistent here, but leans towards the establishment of a realm of pure forms without realizing that these pure forms are mediated, as his successors would say, by their content, just as their content is mediated by their form. This process is described in one of the greatest chapters of Hegel's Logic, 10 with the simplicity of which, remarkably enough, the critique of pure reason did not show itself to be capable, despite its much more elementary nature. In actual fact, a further consequence of the chapter on the paralogisms ought to be that the concept of the subject it contains, and that might be said to be nothing other than the legacy of this rational psychology, should not be allowed to stand as a pure a priori concept. Its a priori nature and the intuitions which are required to give that a priori nature substance, these two realms ought really to stand in a relation of mutual reciprocity. However that may be, I believe that I have said enough to persuade you that Kant's so-called profundity cannot be taken to mean profundity in a psychological sense. One reason for this is that the entire sphere of psychology is demoted to the level of mere appearance and is not even assigned to the a priori world. Another is that within psychology itself he completely fails to take cognizance of its own depth, to wit, the unconscious mechanisms by means of which such things as identity and non-identity, harmony and disharmony arise in the realm of the psyche. I shall continue with the question of depth in Kant. If I am not mistaken, the concept of depth closest to us, if we were to make use of it nowadays, would be the concept of essence as contrasted with the fact. Aid, the superficial appearance. I shall not inquire who or what is responsible for this curious turn of phrase. It is not clear whether we should blame Hegel's phenomenology and its descendants for dredging medieval realism and the medieval concept of essence from the past, the essentia, or whether this notion of essence and essentiality is an unconscious legacy of Hegelian philosophy itself, in which essence occupies a central position. I do not wish to adjudicate on this matter. At all events, the distinction between essence and appearance does not really appear in Kant. The point at which it might have appeared is the chapter entitled The Ground of the Distinction of All Objects in General into Phenomena and Noumena. This, incidentally, is a chapter one would like to recommend that you read because there is a sense in which it has been constructed in accordance with the principle of once your work is done, it is good to rest. That is to say, once the extraordinary efforts required by the transcendental analysis have been completed, this chapter takes a backward look and collects up, with something of a magisterial gesture, the essential insights that have been established. From this vantage point much light is shed retrospectively on what are in part the very difficult and impenetrable analyses of the earlier chapters. To repeat, by phenomena, by appearances, Kant understands not just the actually given appearances that I perceive at any moment, but the entire world of appearances, that is to say, the world of things in so far as they are known to us, that is, in so far as there are interconnections between appearances. This includes the entire realm of inner experience, the experience of psychological phenomena. The world of noumena, in contrast, would be the world as it is in itself, or, to put it another way, the world as it is revealed to us as a result of pure thought, independently of any given intuitions. In fact, the chapter on phenomena and noumena is the only chapter in which the word essence, Wesen, occurs in Kant. He speaks there of sensible essences and elsewhere of intelligible essences, although it is not absolutely clear what he means by them. We are left with the feeling that it is something of a makeshift term for objects. The passage reads, at the same time, if we entitle certain objects, as appearances, sensible entities, Wesen, phenomena, Then since we thus distinguish the mode in which we intuit them from the nature that belongs to them in themselves, it is implied in this distinction that we place the latter, considered in their own nature, although we do not so intuit them, or that we place other possible things, which are not objects of our senses but are thought as objects merely through the understanding, in opposition to the former, and that in so doing we entitle them intelligible entities. Verstandeswesen, noumena. Why here, then, in this distinction between sensible entities or essences and intelligible entities or essences we plainly have the concept of essence quite without elucidation, and if I am not mistaken this is the only passage in the Critique of Pure Reason where it occurs. However, it is highly symptomatic that the Critique of Pure Reason does not contain a doctrine of essence. It is in general not a bad idea when attempting to appropriate the specific nature of a philosophy not to confine oneself to an examination of the concepts it contains, particularly since the concepts that occur in one philosophy are for the most part also to be met with in others. Thus it is very difficult to grasp the distinctions between two philosophies by focusing on the differences in their basic vocabularies. But it is much easier to isolate the particular features of a philosophy by examining the concepts that it does not contain. I once confided to Walter Benjamin my plan to give an account of a philosophy purely in terms of the concepts that were taboo in it, not those that it employed. 13 He was very enthusiastic about the idea. I carried out this plan, at least in part, in both the texts that I published on Benjamin. 14 I believe it would be worth the effort to produce such an index verbum prohibitorum, an index of forbidden concepts, in the case of Kantian philosophy. The concept of essence would merit a place of honor in such a list. I may remind you here of the passages I read out to you from the chapter on the amphiboles, in which Kant says explicitly and with some feeling that the defining features that the understanding can regard as imparting valid knowledge are all external. They are the defining features of a synthesis that brings together all the appearances as a unity, but that does not venture to unlock the phenomena from within in the way that all the idealists insisted on, even including Schopenhauer on the most crucial point. The reason for Kant's rejection of the concept of essence and the resultant deviation of Kantian depth from what is generally understood by that term will be obvious to those of you who have followed my argument up to now. It is that the insight into the essentials of being, insight into the noumenal world that would constitute such a world of essential being, is simply denied to us. We can have absolutely no knowledge of whatever lies behind the behind the appearances. If then after Kant, above all in Hegel, the concept of essence was able to spring back to life, that was a function of the restructuring process that the entire system underwent in post-Kantian idealism. To make the point another way, I have told you that post-Kantian philosophy ignored the Kantian block. That it said that the things in themselves which we find in Kant are nothing but an empty phrase, and that, moreover, the things in themselves are after all cognizable by us, simply because things in themselves are nothing but reason conscious of itself. Since reason is empowered to have knowledge of the absolute, it is likewise empowered to have knowledge of essences without, of course, remaining fixated on them. Instead, Hegel had the brilliant insight that the two spheres which point in two different directions in Kant, the world of phenomena and the world of noumena, which are separated by one of those trenches so familiar in Kant, stand in a necessarily reciprocal relation to each other. This means that there is no essence without appearance and no appearance without essence. You can picture this quite easily to yourselves by reflecting that it makes absolutely no sense to say that a thing has an essence unless you realize that the same thing must also have a surface, an appearance. Conversely, it is meaningless to speak of the fa or the surface of a thing unless you simultaneously postulate the existence of its essence. Because of the Kantian XWPWT2, because knowledge is not in control of its own true object, this element vanishes from the scene in his philosophy. Formerly, as I have said, space has been reserved for the noumena and therewith for the essential. But Kant says quite explicitly that the consciousness we have of them is quite empty and we can make absolutely no use of it. 16. I should now like to move on and try to confront in all seriousness the question of what can be said to survive. What actually is the substance of this Kantian philosophy? And I hope that none of you will take this to refer to the category of substance about which I have told you more than enough. What I mean to ask is what is the substantial meaning that we are left with in Kant? The answer lies in a revision of the concept of the transcendental that we have to undertake and that will simultaneously introduce us to the way the concept is employed by Kant's successors, by Fichte, Schelling and to a certain extent as early as Reinhold. 17. You should begin by adopting the negative approach I have outlined today. Consider all the things that do not come within the compass of the transcendental. In the first place, the sphere of the transcendental, that is, the realm of the constitutive, of the a priori, of the conditions upon which all experience, all content, is based, is not psychological. For psychology is part of the science of the world. It belongs to the everyday, just like zoology or geography or astronomy, and it therefore presupposes intuition. According to Kant, transcendental philosophy may not be based on that. I am repeating all this so that you should have Kant's concept of the transcendental clearly before you, namely the relatively straightforward and generally comprehensible definition of the transcendental which we took as our starting point. This is the idea that Kant calls all investigations transcendental that are based on the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments. Thus they cannot be psychological even though there is a remarkable similarity between psychological analysis and transcendental analysis. If you take the trouble to examine the mechanisms by means of which Locke, who, curiously enough has the greatest similarity to Kant of all the great philosophers, even though Kant would turn in his grave at the mere thought, if you take the trouble to look at the stages by means of which the concepts of reflection, in other words the only valid form of knowledge, come into being, as contrasted with the ephemeral impressions of the senses, you will discover that this psychological account of the mechanisms of knowledge in Locke is startlingly similar to that of Kant. Point 1. And it has turned out again and again that so-called transcendental analyses, that is to say, analyses of the mechanisms by means of which our knowledge comes into existence, orientate themselves towards the canon of psychology, in other words towards the canon of the interconnections between the elements of consciousness in the empirical consciousness and the elements abstracted from it. Looking in one direction, transcendental analysis is always the abstraction from something psychological, accompanied by declarations to the effect that it has nothing at all in common with psychology. It is nevertheless a remarkable state of affairs that, overtly or tacitly, all philosophers from Kant to Husserl have assumed a kind of parallelism between psychological and transcendental analysis. At the same time, they allow it to escape them again from fear of dirtying their hands with empirical reality and hence of losing touch with the truth in all its purity. However, it is also true that the sphere of the transcendental in Kant must not be a sphere of pure logic. I can show you what this means in a rather pedantic fashion by drawing your attention to one point. This is that if the formal principle of identity were identical with the proposition of the I think that accompanies all my representations, this would spare Kant the inconvenience of making any distinction between formal logic and transcendental logic as a logic that establishes the possibility of experience. For in that event the principle of identity that you find in formal logic would be identical with the basic tenet of transcendental philosophy. Moreover, attempts to prove this very point have repeatedly been made. That is to say, attempts have been made to interpret the proposition A equals A, the pure principle of identity, the supreme law of formal logic, as if it were identical with the proposition of the I think that accompanies all my representations. Please do not misunderstand me here. It is not possible to wish this piece of extreme formal logic away from its position at the very heart of the critique of pure reason. Without this element of the identity of propositions, without the demand that all the judgments in a consciousness should be mutually compatible, the idea of a transcendental consciousness, of the I think that accompanies all my representations would not be possible. For the idea that this I think provides for the unity of all the individual representations contains the logical implication that the I think brings all those representations into a logical relation to one another. It follows that any representations that are incompatible with others in this unity must logically be excluded from it. On the other hand, however, in the critique of pure reason, and this is the crucial factor, this formal identity is a necessary, but not a sufficient factor to establish the nature of consciousness. Further elements are called for. Above all, according to the first version of the Critique of Pure Reason, in section 2 of the Deduction of the Pure Concepts of Understanding, he calls for the synthesis of reproduction in the imagination, 19, that is to say, the presence of an absent thing. Needless to say, I can only speak of reproduction in the imagination 20 if I include a temporal element as a necessary factor. However, formal logic has nothing to say directly about time, although Kant does indeed say at one point that the mathematical, that is arithmetical, operations that we are accustomed to today should be regarded as the operations of a logical calculus and hence of formal logic. As such they would necessarily pass through a temporal sequence. Why thus in this sense the critique of pure reason or the sphere of the transcendental cannot be called logical either, if we have to think of it as the summation of everything to which the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments can refer. Nor, a final point, which I can propose here only in a sentence, can the sphere of the transcendental be metaphysical. This means that it may not surpass the bounds of possible experience. It must not be hypostatized. The concepts of reflection may not be treated in the sphere of the transcendental as if they were things in themselves. I shall have more to say on this point next time. Lecture 20, July 1, 20